Oh, welcome, welcome, folks. Thank you. Oh, look, Gordon is already on to join us. I'm going to invite Gordon to join. And hey, there we go.
Hi,
Hey, Gordon, how are you?
I am okay, thanks.
Yeah, you were saying that this was your first time doing
Yeah,
IG Live?
yes. Uh, but I was able to get a little support from my daughter, who's a lot social media savvy. So yeah.
Amazing, amazing. Well, thank you for joining us today. This is called Monday Meals. It's our IG Live. We do it fairly weekly. We don't do every week, but we try to do it weekly, and it's sort of a homage to the times that I'm sure that you and I both kind of grew up in the movement around, like, where we checked in with our people and we talked about over food and over lunch, like what are you doing and what are you working on, and learning from each other. So this is really just about, this is like two comrades in the movement and other folks, sometimes join to talk, just, so it's kind of free flowing and an easy conversation. And then the idea that why it's called Monday Meals is because I used to do this side hustle where I would make meals on Sunday and then I would deliver them on Monday, and so people would have a nice homemade lunch. And then a byproduct of that, when I got to actually meet folks and like give people nourishment through the food, I got to check in with them, like, how are you doing, and check in with them. So that's why it's called Monday Meals. So we always ask two questions, Gordon. Is introduce yourself, like tell us about who you are, um, and then also, what are you having for lunch? So what are you having, Gordon?
Um, that's a good question. I'm gonna have lunch after this. So I'm just eating some snacking on some Trader Joe's Pop Tarts right now.
Nice. What's the flavor? What flavor are you having?
Is that cherry pomegranate or something? Yeah.
Nice. I didn't know Trader Joe's had Pop Tarts.
And
um, Go ahead.
yeah, and then as far as my introduction, yeah, so I've been a a progressive community and labor organizer here in San Francisco in the Bay Area for over 25 years, and yeah, just and I had particularly I've been the past executive director of the Chinese Progressive Association in San
That's right.
Francisco many years, and then more recently, I was executive director at Jobs with Justice in San Francisco. That's a coalition of progressive unions and community groups and faith-based organizations. So I've just done a lot of work around community and labor organizing, around social, economic, and racial justice issues, and coalition building. And yeah, and always through my work, you know, uh, you know, fighting to hold our city government and state and federal government accountable to the needs of working class communities of color in San Francisco. And then the opportunity for me to run for the Board of Supervisors just kind of opened up in 2018. A bit, yeah, surprised, yeah, a little bit surprisingly, when the incumbent in my district, in District 4 in San Francisco, that's a Sunset District, decided
Mm-hmm.
that run for re-election. So, so that seemed like a good opportunity for me to try to take my progressive community labor organizing and coalition building work to into city government.
I appreciate that. And I see SF Street is asking a question about Chesa Bodine, and I'm going to actually refrain from like answering that question here, because this is Oakland Rising and we have a C3, and so we are barred from actually having those conversations about candidates and that stuff. And so we're not going to answer that question here. I apologize if you were expecting to be able to have that question answered. But I wanted to, today we're talking about fair elections, and one thing that we're working on here in Oakland is democracy dollars, like really looking at campaign finance here in Oakland, and we're hoping to bring that to the ballot in November. And working with an amazing coalition of folks. But I know that in 2019, you have brought a measure and passed it in 2019, campaign finance reform. And before we kind of get into the details of what that was and the impacts of that, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, having been a candidate, what it's like and what it looks like when we see like all kinds of money flowing into our elections and the impacts that that has on folks when they're actually in office, and who gets to participate at the end of the day in elections as a result.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Just as far as the background for the fair elections legislation on since I became supervisor, in San Francisco and just like Oakland, our elections have become increasingly expensive to run and really dominated dominated by big money, corporate interests, and we've seen that we've seen that playing out in San Francisco and just continuing to build over years or really decades. But I think especially since the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, back in 2010, that basically gave corporations unlimited ability to spend unlimited on elections at every level. It's gotten so much worse. And I think in San Francisco, traditionally it had been like the Chamber of Commerce and the real estate and developers that were the main spenders trying to buy elections and influence elections. But then, over the last 20 years or so, we've seen increasingly the tech sector becoming a much bigger player in election spending and corporate influence. So yeah, this has just been a growing problem. It's gotten worse since it's Citizens United. And then when I ran for supervisor, I had the opportunity to run back in 2018 for the District 4 supervisor seat in San Francisco. And that's again on the west side in the Sunset District, which had traditionally been considered a conservative district. It had always been represented by a moderate to conservative supervisor since we went back to district elections in 2000. The opportunity to run as a progressive, labor and community organizer. But, not surprisingly, I faced major spending by the corporate interests in our city. Actually, they spent close to $1 million, either directly supporting my opponent, and most of it was to oppose.
$1 million.
The district
for one district seat.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's an amazing amount of money.
And then they did, most of the money was spent through a PAC, right? Or really a super PAC on a local level. And they gave it a name called, trying to remember, I have it up here, Safe and Clean Sunset Coalition.
Right.
But then in that PAC, raised and spent $727,000. So that was the main source. And then the main source of funding for the Safe and Clean Sunset Coalition was another PAC called Progress San Francisco, which was, and then Progress San Francisco actually received funding from other corporate PACs, like the Committee on Jobs. So it's almost like this shell game of PACs where they're really hiding, the true source of the funding and which corporations and which tech billionaires or wealthy interests are paying. So,
yeah. So I think for folks to know, right? Like PACs we call them they're political action committees, and so they can come together, form, and like Gordon is saying that you could have a PAC donate to another PAC, and so it's sort of like you do have to as a PAC show who gave you the money, right? But once it's sort of layers upon layers upon layers of who, it's like keeping track of where that money is coming from at the end of the day, really is kind of difficult. And because of, Citizens United, the amount that the PAC might give or might run in terms of their own campaign for or against a candidate is kind of limitless, right? And the impacts of that are pretty big, because then you don't actually know whose interest and who's saying what, right? And everyone will notice that when you actually look on a campaign flyer, at the bottom there's usually a box and it'll say who paid for it, right? You'll see the TV ads and it'll say paid for by da 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 committee, and you might think it's the actual candidate, but oftentimes it's not. It's somebody else who's paying for that. And so I've seen, you'll see petitions out there for people gathering signatures to put measures on the ballot, right? And you'll note it. I want everyone to make sure that before you actually sign those, you see who's actually funding that, because they actually might have interests that are complete opposite of yours. And so being clear about where that money, who's paying for what, is an important piece, because the messaging might be really something that actually has nothing to do with the candidate at all, but is in the interest of a corporation. And so to hear almost nearly $1 million being spent on one district race is amazing. Like here, Lyft Corporation spent, I think, about $150,000 through some money against the city council, the rep at large city council race in 2020. But overall, I think they spent close to $1 million in money pouring into Oakland's all overall elections. It wasn't just for that rep at large, but and we've seen a lot of money come through, say, like Bloomberg also gave a lot of money to a lot of our to our school district candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that mean? Like, because to be very transparent and fair, there are also community organizations and like folks that run C4s, and that's a tax delineation for nonprofits that do lobby for candidates or not and so they also form PACs, and unions also form PACs. Like, what's the difference? Like, why are we so worried about this if we also utilize them, or folks in the community utilizes it?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. I mean, I think corporations, as well as unions and other maybe more folks, entities that are on our side, do spend, use PACs in order to as a vehicle for their political campaigns and goals. But I think so one thing that I've been pushing for I immediately started pushing for when I stepped in as supervisor in 2019 is stronger disclosure laws, so that the community can really see who's the true source of funding. And again, in San Francisco, the corporate PACs at least had really increasingly started using these sort of AstroTurf or phony names. Clean and Safe Sunset, that was funded primarily by Progress San Francisco. That's primarily funded by the Committee on Jobs, for example, where it's just really impossible for voters in the community to know who's paying for this, the ads and influence their vote. So I think that's important, is just disclosure and for folks to know who the true source of funds are, whether it's from the corporate side or the union side, which is the main sort of counterbalance to the corporate spending. through PACs. And I feel like, the public will have a very different perspective when they know that, the main money is coming from the San Francisco Association of Realtors for the for Progress San Francisco Clean and Safe Sunset versus for, another PAC that might be SEIU 10-1, for example, which is one of the main unions that, in San Francisco, I think that's been using active politically to support um, candidates that stand with working families, against corporate interests. So I think just even though unions, would be subject to the same and should be subject to the same disclosure laws as the corporations, I think the public will view it quite differently when they really do see who the true source of funding is, a working people's organization versus corporate or realtor interest.
Right. And I think that, as we see, like, just kind of zooming out even farther, right? Like the impact that corporations have actually had in our both our cities, right? And the amount of displacement that has resulted from realtors and their interests. And that we have seen our cities, the face and color of our cities really change as a result of that. And so, yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about that disclosure and, what the disclosure in the city looks like, and what your ballot measure in 2019, what changes that brought? As I was reading it, I was kind of like, oh, I started getting like this big light bulb in my head about like what we might be able to do in Oakland. But I also wanted to share a little bit about like where we're going, but if you could tell us like some of the work that you've done around it, that'd be really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, just also wanted to mention with the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010, it really limits our ability to regulate, corporate spending, on elections and corporate spending to try to influence elections. Uh, but so we've been looking at things that we can do to try to mitigate that and create a more balanced playing field and inform public when it comes to the corporate spending on elections. So one way to do that is by increasing the disclosure requirements, for PAC, for campaign ads that are funded by these PACs or super PACs. So that's what in 2019, after my experience, in running for office and facing this in such an extreme way against me, I started working with a pretty broad coalition of good government advocates in San Francisco, who had already been working on stronger campaign finance disclosure policies in the city. So we came up with a measure called Sunlight on Dark Money that basically requires PAC-funded political ads, whether it's print, TV, radio, or online ads, to disclose, better disclose the true source of funding of that ad. So no longer could they just say, which most of the mail that I faced in 2018 say that this is paid for by Clean and Safe Sunset Coalition and major funding from Progress San Francisco, but it would have to say who Progress San Francisco, the main sources of funding for Progress San Francisco, the top three. It would have to name the top three donors to that PAC, and the amount that they donated, and then if
Where is
one
that
of the top
disclosed
donors.
on? Is that on every is that on every mailer? Is that on every commercial?
Yeah, it's on every mail piece.
Wow.
And the top donors is a PAC itself, then there would need to be a further disclosure of the top three donors for that PAC and how much. So it's on every mail piece. And then it is required also on the TV and the radio ads and social media. But there's, so it's very comprehensive, and we did that as a ballot measure in 2019. That was the Sunlight on Dark Money ballot measure that passed overwhelmingly in 2019, and then it's been in place, and it's helped to at least provide since then, in the last few years, provide clearer information about who's paying, for these ads, particularly through the corporate PACs in San Francisco, but also the union supported PACs as well.
Right, right. So all PACs across the city. That's really that's so interesting. And I'm wondering, like, have you seen an impact in terms of what that has meant for folks, as they go to the polls or as they're receiving this, or the response to the ballot measure itself? Because you said it was overwhelmingly won, and I can't remember the number. That it won by. I'm trying to look where I had found that.
Yeah,
it was 77, a little under 77% had voted yes. That's really high for folks who don't know. That's really high for a ballot measure to win by. And so that means that a lot of folks are really, really asking for this.
yeah, yeah. I think it shows that these types of good government measures that are trying to address the increasing corporate and wealthy individual in our political process are very popular across the political spectrum, and just by moving it as a ballot measure, and it was also a way to educate the public and raise more awareness about this problem as well. So I think that it's really had a very positive impact, both the policy itself in requiring clearer disclosure about the political ads that are paid for by these PACs and super PACs, as well as the educational process through the campaign, which is making voters and in our communities more aware that they should really follow the money when it comes to the increasing political spending that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's the key piece, right? Is where did the money come from? And I think that, when we think about, a lot of folks don't know actually, so we've said some of the ways in which like that money translates into things. So we see political ads, we see mailers. We might also see like folks turning out communications pieces, like maybe through the media, and also that also includes, you get phone banked, you get text messages, you can get some people knocking at your door, depending on how much money the PAC has and is able to create. And so those things, that all that money translates into that. So you start to think that, oh, it's the candidate potentially who is doing this. But oftentimes it is the money that comes from the candidate, through these PACs, and then other ways, right, like independent expenditures and things like that. But we won't get into the total details of that. But it kind of scares me, not scares me, but it puts me on high alert to think about that. When I see that, they can name it any PAC they want. Like when I see Safe and Clean Sunset, I'd be like, hell yeah, I'm down for a safe and clean sunset too, right? Ultimately that's what we want. And so you could say whatever you could put up a front and a name for your PAC in any shape or form you want. And so it's really great to hear that through this ballot measure that was overwhelmingly supported by San Franciscans, like to that, what is it again? Like the top 3 donors
Yep.
have to be disclosed, and the amounts that they've disclosed in terms of their donation.
Yeah, and then importantly, if one of the top 3 donors is a PAC itself, then the further disclosure of that PAC and their top 3 donors. So it's to try to discourage or disincentivize this sort of shell game that they use of creating these different PACs to really hide which corporations and wealthy individuals are really paying for this.
That's great. And in 2020, did it get implemented in the next year, or and how has that been working out for folks?
Yeah, it was implemented, and there were some important races in 2020 for the Board of Supervisors and key, yeah, actually even in 2019 too.
Oh,
Well, we passed it in 2019, so it was implemented in the subsequent elections. And I think again, it really has had a very positive impact just to have that information, the clearer disclosure on all the campaign ads, the various types of campaign ads, and then just the broader awareness of within our communities and our city about how particularly the corporate and big money interests are trying to influence our elections through increasing spending through these PACs and super PACs. So, and then, although Liz, I would say that, like in a lot of these, a lot of areas where we've been able to create, some positive reforms to practices by the corporate sector, they'll figure out ways to get around it.
mm-hmm.
The one key way that we've seen happening in San Francisco of circumventing our Sunlight and Dark Money Disclosure Act is by them using a state PAC instead of a local PAC. So they would create a political action committee or independent expenditure committee as on a state level, even though it's all locally focused. And then in that case, they're not bound by our local disclosure ordinance. So we're seeing increasing use of that.
Oh, wow. So that sounds like something that, there's some work that needs to be done at the state level as well. And, like no ballot measure or no campaign finance reform, like one is a silver bullet, right? It's not going to create completely fair elections immediately. But I think like in concert, like we have several, as we continue to have folks in office who are willing to, and for community members who are willing to really bring the type of policies and the type of ballot measures that can combat that, I think is important to remember, right? Like sometimes folks like hinge on this one thing, like let's win this and then that's going to change it all for us. And we know that that's not necessarily true. And in Oakland, we're trying to bring, we have public finance. I know in San Francisco, y'all have public finance too, for campaigns that in Oakland hasn't been working for us because there are minimum thresholds for the amount of money that they can receive in order to receive this very small amount of money. And like, as you've mentioned and we've talked about here, is that because so much corporate money and so much outside money is coming in, it's inflated the amount of money that campaigns need to run, right? So, for example, in Oakland, we saw where it would only generally cost about $40,000 to run a viable school board campaign. Like I said, the Bloomberg PAC brought in $150,000 to one candidate, right? And it changes the game because it pushes out candidates who have less money, right? Who are the smaller candidates who are really grassroots and are really coming from the community, and that's a big issue for us, right? And so in Oakland, we're trying to bring democracy dollars, right, to Oakland, and there is hold on just one quick second. There is in Seattle, right? They started this campaign finance reform where that what they'll do is they give every eligible person who's eligible to donate to a campaign. So you do have to be a resident of the United States in order to do this, but you get 4 $25 vouchers that can go towards any candidate, right? And so it essentially makes candidates have to go to everybody, right? Because otherwise, a lot of candidates they'll do is they'll just go to the voters who are more likely to vote, right? They don't go to places where folks are really pushed out and marginalized in the community. So, for example, there aren't very many candidates who are going and talking to the unhoused, right? There aren't a lot of folks who are door knocking and doing their stomping in, like, for example, in Oakland, our flatland neighborhoods, right? Because they're poor, they're more immigrants, they're more folks of color, and they are generally targeted to be pushed out of the conversation. And because of all kinds of reasons, have less access, or there are much more barriers to actually voting. So we have a lot of low propensity or less active voters in the flatlands, right? And so candidates tend to not talk to them. And so we think that like this democracy dollars, if we bring that to Oakland, is really going to change the game, because now folks are going to want to get those dollars, because and it really elevates and brings up really small grassroots candidates from the community, because they have to now go out and get those vouchers. And we've seen in Seattle that it actually increased voter turnout at the end of the day, because more people were invested, because they're like, oh, hey, I gave my $100, I gave my $25 to this one candidate, and I'm really excited about it, right? I'm excited to see what's happening. And it also increased small donors on their own, right? Like, well, I have this $25, I could throw in $10 more to give to this candidate too. And so it just increased the amount of participation that people were having. They had more small grassroots candidates. I mentioned like the unhoused in Seattle. They had a candidate who was a homeless advocate, and financed their entire viable campaign. They didn't win, but they had a very viable campaign by getting the vouchers of unhoused residents in Seattle. And so it engaged everybody, started to think, oh shit, now I got to like actually think about the unhoused as a population of people who can participate in this electoral process. We automatically assume because they're unhoused, they're not going to vote, right? And so this engages them. And we've seen over 2 or 3 election cycles where now people are like holding up in their campaign like literature and flyers and ads like, give me your voucher, right? And so it's kind of shifted like who's voting, who's participating, and has really shifted, because now they have a lot more candidates who, because of that, were able to previously going up against this hundreds of thousands or $1 million. Oh my God, I'm still blown away by that, Gordon. Like that, nearly $1 million for one district seat got thrown down. That they have a more viable chance, even if the dollar to dollar amount isn't going to match. The fact that you have to actually go and door knock and get that voucher from somebody or get that dollar from somebody really changes the game, right? It changes the way that we think about how we're talking to people about your candidacy, let's say, right? So we're excited about that here in Oakland, and I'm hoping that we're going to be able to see that change here shift, because you all have this Campaign Disclosure Act, and we're hoping that in Oakland we're going to have this Democracy Dollars Act here, and as a ballot measure that folks will get to vote on in November to change the landscape here. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear that you guys you're planning to move a democracy dollars measure in Oakland. And I've been aware of the Seattle um, effort, and that's just such a transformative approach to campaign finance reform that really empowers, lower income, communities and individuals. So that's so exciting. I would say, in San Francisco, we've taken a more traditional approach to that. And that's just through our public financing of elections for the Board of Supervisors. So we've had the public financing program in place for decades, and it's helped to counterbalance some of the huge spending from the corporate and developer interests. And I did also sponsor legislation in 2019 as well to strengthen our public financing program in San Francisco, where we made some changes to incentivize candidates to seek smaller donations, because the way that our previous public financing rules were set up, the city would match a donation up to $500 at a 2-to-1 rate if it was an eligible contribution, because that was encouraging candidates to seek $500 donations. But so the changes we made in 2019 to our public financing program, this is through legislation that I sponsored, limited the match to donations up to $150. So it's basically candidates to seek smaller donations from a larger number, but it increased the match from 2-to-1 to 6-to-1.
wow.
So it made those smaller donations much more impactful. And so again, I think that's had a positive impact on the supervisor races that happened in 2020. And again, it'll be in place for the races this year. I'm up for re-election in November. And yeah, looking forward to take advantage of the more progressive public financing rules that we have in place now.
Yeah, and so it was enacted, and I'm assuming that it was used in 2020. Did you see, as a result, like an increase of small donations, and did you all see an increase in like voter engagement?
Mm-hmm. I think we definitely saw in the 2020 supervisor races, the more contested campaigns, raising money from a larger number of smaller donors. I mean, that was sort of the policy goal of the changes we made. Mm-hmm. And also just a more of a limit to campaign spending as well. So our public financing program, in order to get the public financing dollars, the candidate has to agree to a voluntary spending limit of $350,000. So so I think so it's had a positive impact. It had a positive impact in 2020, and then and it with the increase from the 2-to-1 match to a 6-to-1 match, but incentivizing smaller donors, it allows the candidates to spend more time just talking to voters and a broader range of voters, and not just trying to raise the $500 contributions.
Yeah, I mean, because like if I know that when it comes to like actual fundraising, like if you don't ask, people aren't giving, right? And so, but they're also on the counter to that is that like, if people are worried about, paying their rent, we have such exorbitant high rents in the Bay and in San Francisco and Oakland, some of the highest in the country, right? So, and that, folks, when they're thinking about those things, it's like, oh, how much can I actually give, right? And so it's always great to hear when we see candidates who are really only seeking, small donation amounts, but it's to really shift some of these things. We need some policies in place because unchecked, corporations and big donors, big money, people, billionaires, millionaires are throwing down thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars towards these campaigns to really shift because, and why that's important at the end of the day is that we need to bring in electeds who sit in office to create policies, not only policies, but budgets. Like the city budget is determined by the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. In Oakland, it's determined by the city council, right? So we need folks there who are going to really think about what are the needs of the community, right? And not just certain folks in the community, but really thinking about like, what's the floor that we all stand on, right? For working, poor, immigrant, folks of color who are usually left out of the conversation, right? They're targeted to be pushed out of the conversation when we think about the budget, right? We're not going any longer to talk to community folk, not any longer, but nobody's talking to people in the community about what would you like to see? Would you like to see more policing or would you like to see better parks, right? Like, what do we really need in the community? And having electeds that are there representing us, and that voice is really important. And just in all fairness to us and to you, and for clarity's sake, like, you know, this is not having you on, and I know that you're running, is not an endorsement by Oakland Rising. So I'm just making sure that that's there. It's on record, y'all. We have this on video. But that we're really here to just talk about like the impacts of big money in candidate races. So appreciate all the work that you're doing, Gordon, in San Francisco, and you know, us right across the bay on the other side, really thinking about like, what does campaign finance reform really look like? What does public campaign finance look like? And what are the ways in which we can create policies that make sure that we have fair elections? And super appreciate you coming on today and learning a new skill, getting on IG Live, and props to your daughter for teaching you.
Thank you, Liz, just for this conversation about these such important issues, especially in Oakland and San Francisco, and what we're dealing with in our elections. But also for all the important work that Oakland Rising does. And we have your sister organization here in SF Rising, who's doing great work here too. So thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yes, props to SF Rising. We love them. We love our partners out there, and the work that you are doing and partnering with the community to make sure those things are happening, and appreciate the years and years of organizing that you have done through, you know, all of the places, including Chinese Progressive Alliance, and the amazing foundations that have been set for us to, you know, work in co-governance with those who are in office. So appreciate all the time. Thank you for those who joined us. I realized that I didn't ask you the other question that we always ask all our candidates, not candidates, our guests. And that is, you know, eating lunch is really about like nourishing our bodies. And I know you're about to go eat and not live off of Pop-Tarts. But like, what are the ways that you nourish yourself? Like your heart, your mind, your spirit, your body. What is that one way? Because I don't like to think about self-care as like this one little act that you do occasionally, but like, what are the ways that you're nourishing yourself these days, Gordon?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and something for a long time. I mean, I'd say for me at this point in my life, it's really making sure I spend time with my family, you know, and really have that in my schedule, you know, every week. Make sure and I'm not just always on my phone, you know, or dealing with things, but just kind of shut it off. And then, the family time is really important at this point in my life. My daughter's in high school, so she's going to be sort of gone pretty soon. So, really about cherishing, the family time at this moment in my life. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much, Gordon. Yeah, my little ones, they're not little, they're like 11 and 13, but that time, that being able to say, okay, actually we're at dinner time, we're just putting this down, we're going to talk, let's talk about how your day is so significant. And I feel like, the when you deprioritize it, it just becomes a habit. And so you have to flip it the other way. And I really appreciate that you scheduled it into your time, because that means that you put a lot of intention to it. So, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. So for folks who are joining now at the end of this, you can watch the whole video because we'll be posting it right after this. You can also follow Oakland Rising at oaklandrising.org, sign up for our newsletter. We'll be running a spring civic engagement program where we're going to be talking to voters coming in a few weeks. And so we'd love some volunteers for that. And then, and we're gearing up to really see more information, and we're going to be sharing more information about the Democracy Dollars that campaign that we're running, and would love for you to get involved with that. So, and then if you feel it in your heart to donate to Oakland Rising, any dollar amount helps. So oaklandrising.org/donate, and you can go there, follow all our social media. And we've tagged Gordon's social media. I don't know if he wants he wants all the followers, but definitely follow him and follow the work that he's doing in his elected position. So really appreciate you, Gordon. Have a great day.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks to Oakland Rising.
Have a great day. Bye.
All right. Bye.